Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to spend this time with you. This video is referencing Mohamed El Shorbagy and the recent semifinals from the World Championships where he played Paul Coll. Now I know El Guna is about to finish. I'm a little bit late, but I figured it's better late than never, and there's a ton of value in this video. So here's what you can expect. After the match against Paul Coll, Mohamed Shorbagy made some interesting comments in the post-match interview. And there's a little bit of history behind that, so I'm going to talk a bit about that. And then we're going to talk about the implications of all of that, from the power of our environment to how our personality affects our game, how our values, our beliefs, our perceptions and understandings of different things impact our game. So here's what I'm talking about. That big screenshot taken from squashsite.co.uk is the transcript of from part of Mohamed Shorbagy's post-match interview. And he essentially congratulated Paul Coll for being an amazing athlete and being a source of inspiration and how he's been unbelievable. And he goes on to say that there's a ton of pressure when you're seated number one in a World Championships. And he had so much on his plate this week. And then he references something that I was unaware of, and maybe you were aware of this. So Rob Owen, Paul Coll's coach, was interviewed, and an article was published on the PSA Squash website. And essentially, in that article, Rob Owen talked about how Paul Coll has improved significantly. And he talked about several of the other players on tour, and how each of them have some gaps in their games, and how he's been working with Paul's game, etc., etc. And I'm going to tell you exactly what he said. But first I want to show you what Shorbagy said, because I'm going through the sequence of events the way they occurred and unfolded in my life. So Shorbagy said, I want to thank someone, to be honest. I want to thank his coach, Rob Owen, for such a stupid article he posted 2 or 3 days ago, if I'm honest with you. That was one of the most foolish things to do, to be honest. His player had so much pressure on himself this week, and when I read this article, to be honest, me and my team just laughed, because we knew that he put double the pressure on his player. I felt bad for Paul, because you don't do that to your own player. You don't do that when your player has so much on his plate. I felt bad for him, and I knew this was going to put so much pressure on him. That was one of the most stupidest articles I've ever read, and I really hope, as good as he is as a great coach, he showed that he has no experience with his player being seated number one in a world champ. So thanks to him, he gave me such an advantage in winning that 5th game, because Paul had so much in his mind in that 5th game today. So thanks, Rob, for the article. Thanks so much. A few things to take from this. The first point that you see on at the top of your screen is motivation. So Shorbagy really used Rob Owen's words as a source of motivation, and that's extrinsic motivation. It's motivation that's coming from an external source. Shorbagy was fueled, and I'm going to talk about environment in a minute. He's also now training with Gregory Gaultier. Shorbagy was fueled by Rob Owen's words, and I'm going to tell you what those words are in a minute. The one thing that came to my mind is that Shorbagy is an influential figure in the world of squash. And this is my opinion. Personally, I feel that there could have been a slightly more appropriate way of mentioning the positive effect that Rob Owen's words had on him. That's because there are a lot of people that are looking up to Shorbagy. There are a lot of people that are listening to him, reading what he has to say, and we have to set appropriate examples when we are in positions of power. The thing I want to say about motivation as well is that extrinsic motivation, like using this as fuel to prove something, that's fantastic, and it can work in the short run. But one thing that happens over the long run is that if we are primarily fueled by extrinsic sources, and I'm not saying Shorbagy is, this is a one-off, but if we are primarily fueled by extrinsic sources, then fulfillment and joy often evades us, because we're always trying to compare ourselves to something outside of us. And we're always leveraging something else, and we're dependent on something else for motivation and drive instead of something that comes from within. So there is an extinguishable source of motivation, which is the extrinsic side, and that is also not within our control, and then we can form a dependency on it. And then there's the intrinsic source of motivation, which is inextinguishable. Extrinsic is extinguishable, intrinsic is inextinguishable. It's kind of like the sun. It keeps providing energy, and it comes from within, and it's within our control for the most part. So some things to think about from when it comes to fuel source, motivation source, and what's really driving us. Now here's the reason why Shorbagy was so fired up. This is an excerpt, again, you can find this online on the PSA Squash website. And he essentially said, referring to Paul, there are no obvious weaknesses. Physically, mentally, and technically, Paul is the best he has looked, and he has more and more variety in shot quality. And unless the others improve, they will not beat him. Fair enough. But I don't see them putting in that work, as Paul is beating them easier than he was before. Now we are at a stage that these guys have lost to him several times in a row, and that just makes things easier for him from a mental aspect. Also fair. Then he talked a little bit about each player. He talked about Ali Farag, and he talked about some other folks. And the next two little captions are from about Shorbagy. So he said, in terms of Mohamed El Shorbagy, he could come out and have a brilliant day, but I don't see it. To win a world championship, you're going to need to win 4 matches in a row. And the way he is playing, I don't see him doing that, as I just feel his level has dropped. Mohamed has made some mistakes in the last couple of years in terms of where he has gone, and I think his movement has deteriorated. Personally, I think he has put too much emphasis on getting fitter rather than working on his technique and strategy, while also making his movements smoother, like I did with Paul. All of these could be fair comments. There could be, one could say that there are appropriate times and mediums by which one could share this, and there might be inappropriate times and mediums, and clearly the timing of these comments really fueled Shorbagy. And I hope from all of this, all parties can learn, including us, because we see certain things that happen, and maybe in the future Rob will be even more cognizant of the timing of his comments and the nature of his comments. And maybe Shorbagy will be more cognizant about the way he delivers a message as well. And maybe the relationship between Paul and Rob will get even stronger from this. And maybe all of us can learn something from this too, about the interactions in our own lives when it comes to communication, effectiveness, timing, quality, type, etc. So I wanted to put this out there for all of us to see. Now the next thing I want to talk about very briefly is the power of our environments. And we see that Shorbagy in the last couple of months has now gone to Gregory Gaultier, his former rival in many ways and competitor, has now become his mentor and coach. And one of the things that Shorbagy had lost over the last few months, or maybe that he couldn't find and access and tap into, was that beast mode, that fire, that fuel, that aggressiveness. And Gaultier was one of the guys that demonstrated that, and he has that in spades. And now with Shorbagy working with Gaultier, you can clearly see that drive, that desire, that grit, all of that beast mode, all of it coming back. And this is really important for all of us, because, and research has shown this as well, there are different things like emotional contagion is an idea that emotions are transferable, and we can see that in terms of that kind of that aggressiveness, that drive and that grit that Gregory Gaultier has always demonstrated. Now Shorbagy brought it back. That could be an example of emotional contagion. And in general, our environments really have a significant impact in terms of how we think, how we act, the habits and routines we follow through with, etc. So when you're thinking about yourself, this could be an opportune time for personal reflection. What sort of environments are you in? And again, there's no good or bad, so this is not a judgment thing. It comes down to what sort of goals and aspirations we have in our lives and where we want to go. So if you look in the mirror and you're sitting in front of the television or your phone or surfing YouTube or whatever it is that floats your boat, if you're doing that for 5-6 hours a day or 3-4 hours a day, if you have aspirations, let's say, to improve your squash, maybe there's a more appropriate way to do that. Now, if you think about your environment, are you surrounding yourself by people who also sit on their phones or on social media for extended periods of time? Or are your friends into a lot of TV shows and you guys binge watch TV shows? And again, there's nothing wrong with any of this. It comes down to kind of what one's goals are and what one wants to achieve. So on the other hand, and I'll give you an example. One of the students that I was coaching, she decided to take a year off school in order to go train full-time for squash. And she and I just had a conversation. She's actually not even training locally anymore. She's training elsewhere. And she and I had a conversation very recently. And she said that visiting home and hanging out with her friends of many, many years, who she obviously still loves tremendously. But visiting these friends isn't enjoyable anymore because that environment for her friends is just about sitting and watching TV, being on their phones, drinking to have a good time. She has gone into an environment where she's training twice a day, eating in a healthy way, journaling, reflecting, doing fitness conditioning training, like full in with other athletes. It was harder for her to train like that in this environment because we kind of get sucked back based on what we're surrounded with, because you get little cues and triggers from whatever you're near and whatever's around you. In an environment where everyone's training, everyone's pushing themselves, it's easier to do that. Now there is a dark side to that as well, because you don't want to get into this place of excess pushing and being overly outcome oriented and being excessively harsh on yourself if you're not hitting certain milestones or targets. There still needs to be a balance there of non-judgment and looking at our progress relative to ourselves. And I have to share it, John Wooden's definition of success, where it is based on effort and it's all about doing the best that you're capable of at any point in time. So if you can kind of merge those two worlds, that's probably the best outcome. Now, this piece on personality is really important. We can see that Shorbagy, and I'm going to show you a few clips, we can see that Shorbagy takes his space. He does move into the line of his opponent. He plays aggressively. He takes a high tee position. He attacks the ball really short. He plays at a fast tempo. He has a lot of variety and aggressiveness even when he's not totally set. So his risk to reward ratio is skewed kind of higher relative to, say, Paul Coll, where he's willing to take more risk in order to get reward. Paul Coll, on the other hand, and I'm going to show you a clip in a minute, makes himself a little bit smaller when he's in the middle of the court. He allows his opponent through to play the ball. He does let out emotion, but it's not anger, and it's not directed at anyone. And he plays this controlled, measured, slightly kind of medium pace type of squash. He doesn't attack the front court as much, especially not out of the back corners. He's developed more shot options now, but he doesn't have a ton of that kind of killer instinct, go for the ball sort of piece. And a lot of this comes down to personality. It comes down to values, beliefs, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So let's take a minute and look at some highlights demonstrating the differences between these players. So this first highlight, we get to see Shorbagy hitting out the middle of the court there, and now we get to see Paul Coll hitting out of the middle of the court there. And there are two very, very different approaches. So let's show you this again. So coming back over here, I'm going to slow this down. So loose ball comes, and you see Shorbagy hit, and as he's hitting, he's pushing back into the middle of the court in order to take some room and take some space so that Paul Coll has a difficult time getting through to the next ball. And we'll talk about certain things related to this right at the end. So please pay attention to these clips because we're going to have a little review session. Now you see Paul Coll coming into the middle of the court, and when he hits, he's not extending himself, not making himself very large, giving Shorbagy room to get back to the tee, and he's coming back to the tee in a more kind of normal, I would say normal way. And I'm personally more like Paul Coll, so it's easier for me to relate to him. I've never been good at blocking, don't consciously know how to block effectively, and I'm not a huge fan of it. I like to kind of play a more free-flowing squash, but again, everyone's preferences are different. Now the second clip I'm going to show you is another example of Shorbagy taking his space. So there it is, and another push forward to kind of block Paul Coll's line. The third example, actually this is another angle, and there you see it. Like Paul Coll hits, does well to get out of the way. Shorbagy's in the middle of the court, and as you see, as he's going to strike, he's pushing back. Strike and push back and forward. So right into Paul Coll's line, so he has no way of getting to that ball. The next clip is another example. Shorbagy goes there, and this time he steps forward when he hits that ball. So let me show you this one again. Volley, and then after hitting that volley, he takes that left leg forward, and he gets there to block Paul Coll's line. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Then there was what I'm calling the sequence. And the sequence was this. Paul Coll hits a wicked winner, and then he yells. And he yelled in the direction of Shorbagy, but it was not directed at Shorbagy, and Shorbagy is clearly not happy. So, and you see this, like, in my opinion, I don't think he yelled directed at Shorbagy. So he's there, he's yelling because he hits a rolling Nick, and he's down 9-6 in the game, so that's a big point for him. And then you see he starts kind of turning to the front as he's yelling. It's not like he's looking in Shorbagy's eyes, in my opinion. And Shorbagy's clearly not happy about that. And then Shorbagy starts coming up to him, and he's probably saying something like, what are you saying? Are you saying something? What do you like? Something like that. I'm lip reading here, and I'm not a lip reader, but it sounds like Paul Coll's saying nothing. Shorbagy's questioning him, and it sounds like he's saying nothing. And then Shorbagy's clearly pissed off, and Paul Coll is kind of just smiling at the whole thing. And in the very next rally, Shorbagy gets a bit of a stroke, and then he yells in Paul Coll's face, and Coll is just kind of smiling about it. So, different personalities, different approaches to the game. The last thing I want to share is that even though Paul Coll was smiling, that was 1-1, 9-7. Watch what happens as the match goes on. And when you continuously get shut out, now it's 2-2 and Shorbagy's up 6-2. And Shorbagy hits this ball down the middle, and you see he stepped forward into Coll's line. And then Coll's going back, can't get it obviously because of that bump. And then he gets noticeably frustrated, and I didn't show it, but he kind of hit his hand on the back, glass back as well, kind of saying, what is that? So even though he was smiling, even though he has a cool, calm demeanor, this goes to show that no matter how settled you are, at some point when things keep happening, everyone gets unsettled. It took Coll an hour and a half to kind of get unsettled. So from that perspective, that was a strategic approach for Shorbagy. Credit to him for getting Coll to that point. But some people might get unsettled on the first one, right? So it's all comes down to strategy, personality, approach. Now the question, this is the essential discussion in my mind. The first question, what common themes did you notice when Shorbagy was blocking and taking up space in the middle of the court? They were all off of loose balls. So if you watch the very first one, we come back here for a minute. Coll hits a weak cross court that pops right into the middle of the court. Shorbagy's hitting from the middle of the court. He is going to take his space. There it is. We look at the second one really quickly. Another loose ball over there. Shorbagy's going to shut him out. Let's look at this one, this third one here. Coll hits another relatively weak, not super weak, but I mean it's on Shorbagy's volley, right through the middle of the court. Shorbagy's going to take his space. So when you think about this, the point that comes to mind is focusing on controllable factors. So in this question, what is within the control? Paul Coll cannot control Shorbagy's movement. The only way he can affect Shorbagy's movement is by hitting better quality shots that Shorbagy is not able to cut off in the middle of the court and block Paul Coll out. That is the only thing we can control. And I'll share a personal example with you. Many years ago when I was in my early 20s, or maybe even my mid-20s, I remember playing this guy, and exactly what Shorbagy was doing to Coll, that guy was doing to me. And I was so frustrated. I was livid. Why is this guy not letting me through to the ball? Why is he constantly blocking, etc., etc.? And then I reflected more recently, truthfully, because at that time I wasn't aware. I reflected more recently and I realized that he was doing that because many of my lengths were popping out into the middle of the court and he was taking his space. Now, again, going back to this third point you see, there's always going to be a gray zone when it comes to this discussion. Some people will be of the opinion that if you hit a loose ball, you should be blocked out, you should be punished for hitting a loose ball, and I'm entitled to take as much space as I want. Other people will say, sure, take some space, but don't deliberately move into the line of your opponent. Take some space, make yourself a bit bigger, make yourself hard to move around, but don't walk into their line and make yourself big at the same time. And other people might just hit the ball cleanly and then say, go get it. Like Rami Ashur did that all the time. Someone would hit a loose ball, and Rami would hit it, and then he would deliberately kind of shrink himself up to let the guy through. So all very different perspectives. And some of the considerations you see in point 4 are that different values that we embody, so winning at all costs and doing anything to get a competitive advantage, if that's a value, then our actions are going to be different from someone whose value is to go out and play, air quotes, fairly, the way they define fairly in their minds, and the actions are going to be very different. If our beliefs or interpretations of the rules are a little bit different, then that's going to impact our actions. So for example, if Shorbagy's thinking, hey, if my opponent hits a loose ball, I can take as much space as I want and they have to work around me, well, his actions are going to be different. Personality is going to have an effect. So if Cole's personality is naturally a little bit more subdued, a little bit more calm, a little bit more, whatever word you want to use relative to the way Shorbagy was playing, for instance, that's going to happen. Shorbagy is a little bit more aggressive with his personality and his movement, at least on court. Off court, he could be very different. And then there are the player dynamics. So it could be that Shorbagy's kind of assertiveness and his aggressiveness can almost overshadow or subdue Paul Coll's natural form of aggressiveness or assertiveness. And all of this comes out in obviously the way they play. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please give it the thumbs up. Please leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts because this is obviously a controversial subject. Everyone has different opinions and I respect yours. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so and share the video with someone you think might benefit from it. That goes a long way to help the channel grow as well. And lastly, for anyone that wants a holistic, customized coaching program to improve their game, and if that's you and you're ready to put in consistent effort, you're keen to work directly with me, and you value premium, high-quality services, send me an email at ahad@arproformance.com, and let's see if we are the right fit to work together. Take care, everyone. It is good to see that the beast is back. Let's see how things continue to unfold in El Laguna and in future tournaments. Have a good one. I'll see you in the next video.